Well, thank you, AJ, for that generous introduction. Nothing like being described as somebody who was very young. Can I, of course, acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, traditional custodians of the lands we gather on today, pay my respects to all Indigenous people present, and commit myself as a member of the government to the implementation in full of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. I'd like to thank Transparency International for the invitation to acknowledge your CEO, Clancy Moore, National Anti-Corruption Commissioner Paul Brereton, Deputy IBAC Commissioner Kylie Kilgore, and AJ Brown, who has been a force of nature in the battle against corruption and for transparency. Transparency International's definition of corruption is the misuse of entrusted power for private gain. Much of what's written about corruption focuses on its immorality, and it's certainly true. Corruption is deeply immoral. But I want to make the case today that corruption also has an economic cost. But before I get into that, let me tell you a story. While Australia's had many corruption scandals, the Fitzgerald inquiry and the systematic corruption among police and Queensland politicians it unearthed stands out, both because of the scale of the corruption it revealed and the long-term impact that it had. Historian Raymond Evans describes the Fitzgerald inquiry as the most remarkable commission of inquiry in Australian history. In 2009, in the lead up to the 20th anniversary of its tabling to Parliament, then Premier Anna Bligh said, "In many ways, the Fitzgerald inquiry was at Queensland's Berlin Wall. It washed away an old regime and heralded a new era. Nothing in Queensland's political landscape has been the same since." Begun after an iconic episode of Four Corners, the Moonlight State had revealed illegal gambling and prostitution operating under the protection of crooked cops. The system saw corrupt police officers take payments from the sex industry. It was called the joke, but the cost was no laughing matter. While the direct financial impact it has was substantial, by the 1980s, tens of thousands of dollars in bribes were being paid each month to senior police. The culture that grew up around the crooked cops went far beyond one industry. To quote the Fitzgerald report, "The latest segment of evidence involving political figures demonstrated that misconduct in the police force was not isolated, but part of a wider malaise to do with attitudes to public office and public duty." And indeed, the Fitzgerald inquiry may never have happened if then Premier Joh Bjelke-Petersen hadn't been on a trip to the United States on the night that Moonlit State aired. As a result, it fell to acting Premier Bill Gunn to initiate the inquiry. The inquiry ultimately led to 4 former state ministers and multiple senior police being found to have engaged in corrupt conduct, and the establishment of the Queensland Crime and Misconduct Commission, now the Crime and Corruption Commission, in 1988. Corruption ultimately brought Joh's premiership to an end. According to party room records revealed years later, Joh was allegedly set to receive up to $20 million to facilitate the construction of what would have been the world's tallest building in Brisbane. His National Party colleagues refused to wave the deal through, so Joh tried to reshape the cabinet. He demanded 5 ministers resign. They refused. He demanded the Governor of Queensland call an election despite the Parliament being only a year old. The Governor declined. Joh was ultimately challenged by Mike Ahern, ending 19 years as Premier. He was put on trial for perjury in 1992, but the jury deadlocked. According to another episode of Four Corners, a later inquiry conducted by Justice Bill Carter found the jury selection had been manipulated by ex-police officers, helping to put Joh before a jury led by Young Nationals member Luke Shaw. When corruption really gets into the bones of a society, the damage it does to institutions can take generations to heal. Assessing the cost to the wider political culture is much harder, and it's one of the reasons why Transparency International's work's made such a contribution to our understanding of corruption. Despite being merely 30 years old, Transparency International's research and advocacy have shaped how we see corruption. The Corruption Perceptions Index has become the leading global indicator of public sector corruption. The World Bank's described the Corruption Perceptions Index as the most valid measure of the magnitude of official corruption in many countries. I also want to acknowledge the importance of Transparency International's advocacy in the establishment of international agreements on corruption. Transparency International's advocacy has contributed to the OECD's Foreign Bribery Convention in 1999 and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption in 2003. Indeed, in March of 2023, Transparency International was declared an undesirable organisation in Russia, a mark both of the importance of your work and the risks of speaking truth to power. 60 days ago today, Australia's National Anti-Corruption Commission began its work. As Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus said of the legislation to create it, this is the single biggest reform to the Commonwealth integrity framework in decades. One thing we've learnt is that tackling corruption doesn't just reduce crime, it strengthens public trust in institutions and improves the delivery of services. To date, the NAC has received 738 referrals, and it's likely they'll have plenty to do in the foreseeable future. The campaign for a National Anti-Corruption Commission has a long genesis. Transparency International has been advocating for a National Anti-Corruption Commission since 2005. The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption was established in 1988, and it's taken a quarter of a century since then to establish its federal counterpart. One notable New South Wales ICAC investigation was Operation Savoy in 2002, which ultimately found that an employee of the Australian Museum had stolen more than 2,000 items over 5 years, including 339 mammals, 32 reptiles, and somewhere between 32 and 46 fish. It's an example because it's a reminder of why an independent corruption body is so important. Without proper mechanisms to investigate and unearth corruption, it can be allowed to run rampant in unexpected places that are subject to far less scrutiny than the office of a Premier or a Prime Minister. So it's reassuring to know there's finally a Federal Anti-Corruption Commission, not just to secure the museum collections of Canberra's institutions, but also because, as Transparency International's own Corruption Perceptions Index highlights, perception matters when it comes to the integrity and transparency of government. Indeed, although Australia's traditionally done quite well in the Corruption Perceptions Index, under the last government our rank dropped precipitously. Between 2013, the final year of the Gillard government, and 2021, the final full year of the Morrison government, Australia fell 11 places in the rankings to 18th in the world, the worst result in our history. Over that same period, New Zealand was consistently in the top 3 in the world. In January in this year, for the first time in a decade, Australia's ranking in the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index rose, lifting us 5 places to 13th, just ahead of Canada, Estonia and Iceland, just behind Ireland, Luxembourg and Hong Kong. Transparency International directly attributed this jump to the introduction of the landmark Anti-Corruption Commission. So how do we begin estimating the economic cost of corruption? The clandestine nature of corruption can make it difficult. But Australian researcher Tony Ward estimates that the fall in the Corruption Perceptions Index over the 9 years of the coalition government equated to 0.6% lower economic growth. And I want to now briefly outline 10 reasons why corruption has an economic cost. First, corruption increases the cost of doing business. Companies operating in corrupt environments face higher costs due to bribery demands, unofficial fees and bureaucratic delays. The World Economic Forum estimates that corruption increases the cost of doing business by up to 10% globally. And while the direct cost of the bribe may be relatively easy to calculate, the financial cost on the rest of the system may exceed the amount redistributed by a huge multiple. Second, corruption undermines competition and innovation. Corruption can create barriers to entry for new businesses, limiting competition and stifling innovation. Corrupt economies are, by their very nature, uncompetitive economies. If bribes are the price of entry, then only those who can afford to pay a bribe have a chance to get started. In economies where bribery is the pathway to success, the incentive to invest, to innovate, disappears. Investing in new ideas takes time and money that could be spent convincing officials to grant a contract or block a competitor's proposal. Third, corruption worsens infrastructure. In 2016, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative estimated that the total value of global construction output is $17 trillion a year, of which $6 trillion could be lost annually through corruption, mismanagement and efficiency. They said it's difficult to determine precisely the value of losses through corruption, but estimates tend to range between 10 and 30%. Researchers at the International Monetary Fund have noted that large-scale public procurement can be a hotspot for corruption. Such projects often have unique features that make it harder to compare costs and easier to conceal bribes and inflate costs. Corruption distorts public spending. Corrupt officials might divert public funds intended for essential services, such as education and healthcare, to their own pockets, resulting in inadequate public services. As the International Monetary Fund notes, corruption can distort spending priorities. As they write, grand corruption is usually associated with complex and costly projects, such as construction and defence equipment. By comparison, it's harder to collect bribes on teachers and healthcare workers' wages. As a result, spending on education and health is likely to be lower where corruption is high, making it less likely that worker productivity and living standards will improve. The share of the budget dedicated to education and health is 1/3 lower in more corrupt countries. Fifth, corruption reduces human capital. When access to education depends on talent rather than connections, it undermines meritocracy and deters outsiders from seeking spots at the best institutions. One of the strengths of a good education system is that it allocates places to those who will benefit most and then provides a high-quality education. But a corrupt system admits the wrong people to educational institutions and erodes the quality of those institutions. Sixth, corruption sickens our healthcare system. It diverts resources from the sick and can very literally cost lives. Especially in the post-COVID era, corruption has been the subject of detailed studies tracking the very direct and disturbing impact of corruption on healthcare. Researchers have noted that corruption can impact the construction and maintenance of health facilities, the purchase of equipment and supplies, the distribution of drugs, safety regulations. A 2015 paper on the financial cost of health fraud in the United States estimated that of the $7 trillion spent on health that year, the total loss to fraud and corruption was $455 billion. The toll extracted by the corrupt official who takes a bribe from a dodgy doctor and gives them a job isn't just measured in the monetary exchange, but by the suffering of patients, perhaps numbering as many as 140,000 a year. Seventh, corruption reduces investment. Corruption creates an unpredictable and risky business environment, deterring foreign investors from committing capital to corruption-prone countries. Columbia University's Xin-Jin Wei argues that corruption operates like a tax on investment, with that tax rate sometimes being as high as 20%. For countries that rely on investment to create jobs and boost earnings, corruption can erode this important source of productivity growth. Eighth, corruption decreases tax revenues. Research from the International Monetary Fund suggests that revenues are higher in countries perceived to be less corrupt. They estimate that in the least corrupt governments collect 4% of GDP more in taxes than countries at the same level of development with the highest level of corruption. The International Monetary Fund estimates that if all countries were to reduce corruption in a similar way, they could gain revenues equal to 1.25% of global GDP. We pay our taxes in large part because we believe others are doing so. By undermining that social compact, corruption can hollow out government revenues. Ninth, corruption worsens income inequality. Corruption exacerbates inequality as it benefits the wealthy and well-connected and diverts resources away from poverty alleviation programs. Corruption increases income inequality and poverty through lower economic growth, through biased tax systems, poor targeting of social programs, use of wealth by the well-to-do to lobby government for favourable policies, lower social spending, and a higher risk in investment decisions of the poor. And 10th, corruption erodes trust in government institutions and undermines social cohesion that's fundamental to a dynamic economy. Researchers have found that efforts to control corruption increase levels of trust in the ability of the state and market institutions to reliably and impartially enforce law and the rules of trade. Conversely, as the International Monetary Fund puts it, the distortion of laws and corruption of officials reduce public trust in the state, weakening the willingness of citizens to obey the law. So in conclusion, corruption diminishes us all. To live in a corrupt society is to live a less fulfilling life. But corruption has economic costs too. It undermines health and education. It diminishes tax revenues. It worsens inequality. It discourages investment and it erodes trust. That's why our government is proud to have established the National Anti-Corruption Commission and why all Australians have benefited from the valuable work that Transparency International has done since its inception in 1993. Just as corruption is a public ill, the work of fighting it is a public good. And I thank you on behalf of the community for all you've done to make Australia a more honest and transparent nation. Thanks very much.